Have you ever wondered what it truly takes to break a human spirit? And more importantly, what happens when that spirit refuses to shatter? Tonight, I want to share something with you that has haunted me since the first time I stumbled upon this story, buried in forgotten archives and whispered testimonies passed down through generations. This is not the kind of tale they teach in textbooks. This is not sanitized history, wrapped in comfortable distance. What I'm about to tell you happened on American soil, in the humid parishes of Louisiana, where the Mississippi River carried more than just water and commerce. It carried secrets, it carried screams that the night swallowed, and it carried the rhythm of feet that would eventually spell doom for those who thought they owned them. His name was Ezekiel. They called him Dancing Zeke because they forced him to entertain at their lavish parties. They laughed at his movements. They threw coins at his feet. They made him perform until his legs trembled and his lungs burned. But what they never understood, what their arrogance blinded them from seeing, was that every step, every stomp, every turn of his body was speaking a language older than their plantations, a language of survival, a language of war. If you are new here and you believe that hidden histories deserve to be told, consider subscribing to this channel. What you are about to witness will change how you understand resistance, courage, and the unbreakable nature of hope. By the end of this story, you will never hear music the same way again. You will never watch someone dance without wondering what their feet might truly be saying. Stay with me, because the night of October 17, 1857, is about to unfold before your eyes. The ruins of Beaumont Plantation still stand along a forgotten stretch of the River Road in Louisiana, approximately 43 miles northwest of New Orleans. Spanish moss hangs from ancient oaks like the beards of witnesses too old to speak but too stubborn to forget. The main house collapsed decades ago, but fragments of its foundation remain. Cracked marble stairs leading nowhere, wrought iron railings twisted by time and fire, and a single brick chimney pointing accusingly at the sky. Local residents avoid this place after sunset, not because of any rational fear, but because on certain autumn nights, when the wind shifts direction and the river fog creeps inland, they swear they can hear something. A rhythm, a pattern of beats against packed earth that seems to pulse up from the ground itself, as if the soil remembers what happened there and cannot help but replay it endlessly. The historians call it the Beaumont Incident, a dry clinical term for what transpired during the harvest celebration of 1857, but the descendants of those who survived call it something else entirely. They call it the night the dance spoke. What you are about to hear is not simply a story of vengeance, though vengeance certainly played its part. This is a meditation on the nature of human dignity, on the incredible capacity of the oppressed to transform their chains into instruments of liberation, and on the terrifying price that tyranny eventually pays for its arrogance. At the center of this history stands a single figure, a man born into bondage approximately 32 years before the events in question, possessed of an extraordinary gift that his enslavers sought to exploit for entertainment, and burdened with losses so profound that they would have destroyed any ordinary soul. Ezekiel did not break. He waited, and when the moment arrived, his feet told a story that the masters of Beaumont Plantation would carry to their graves. If you want to follow more cases like this, ones that shake the foundations of what we think we know about history and reveal truths that powerful forces tried to bury, subscribe to this channel so you never miss an investigation. The door to the past is opening. Step through with me. Beaumont Plantation sprawled across approximately 4,000 acres of prime Louisiana soil in St. James Parish, its boundaries marked by the serpentine curve of the Mississippi to the east and endless fields of sugarcane to the west and north. The main house stood 3 stories tall, built in the Greek Revival style favored by the region's wealthiest planters, with 14 Doric columns supporting a gallery that wrapped around the entire structure, like the embrace of a possessive lover. Within this architectural monument to wealth extracted from human suffering, the Beaumont family presided over an empire of sugar. Augustine Beaumont III, master of the estate since his father's death from yellow fever in 1849, maintained a force of 347 enslaved workers at the time of our story. These human beings were cataloged in leather-bound ledgers alongside livestock and farming equipment, their value calculated in dollars and their humanity systematically denied. The hierarchy of Beaumont was as rigid and as carefully maintained as the rows of cane in its fields. At the apex sat Augustin himself, a man of 41 years whose soft hands and expanding waistline testified to a life of comfort built entirely on the labor of others. Below him circled his wife Marguerite, a woman from an old New Orleans family whose primary concerns revolved around social standing and the latest fashions from Paris. Their 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, were being raised to inherit not only the land, but the casual cruelty that made its exploitation possible. Beneath the family stretched the white overseers, 5 in number, each responsible for a different section of the plantation's operations. Their names would become important later. Harlan Cobb, who supervised the fields; William Pierce, master of the sugar house; Tobias Reeve, responsible for the stables and livestock; Samuel Dunn, who managed the storage buildings and transport; and most notorious of all, Cornelius Vance, whose official title was Discipline Master, but whose true function was the systematic terrorization of anyone who dared resist or falter. The day at Beaumont began when the sky held only the faintest suggestion of gray on its eastern edge. The sound of the horn, a conch shell whose mournful call had announced suffering since the plantation's founding in 1793, pulled the enslaved from their quarters, long, low buildings of unpainted cypress wood, divided into rooms of roughly 12 feet by 12 feet, each housing between 6 and 8 people regardless of familial connections. The floors were packed earth. The walls admitted wind and rain through gaps that no one bothered to repair. The roofs leaked, and in summer the interiors became ovens that made sleep nearly impossible. From these structures emerged the workforce that made Beaumont profitable: men, women, and children as young as 7, all moving toward the fields in a procession that had repeated itself every morning for decades. They worked from what the overseers called can see to can't see, from the moment there was enough light to distinguish a cane stalk until darkness made labor impossible. During harvest season, which ran from October through December, the hours extended further still, with shifts in the sugar house continuing through the night as the boiling kettles required constant attention. The instruments of control at Beaumont were many and varied. The whip, of course, was omnipresent. Cornelius Vance carried a particularly vicious example made of braided leather that he had named Salvation, claiming with blasphemous humor that it saved souls from the sin of laziness. But beyond the whip existed an entire taxonomy of torment: the stocks, where offenders might be locked for days with minimal food or water; the sweatbox, a coffin-sized wooden structure left in the sun into which rebellious workers were sealed; the iron collar with protruding spikes that prevented the wearer from lying down or resting their head; and the practice of selling down the river, the threat of separation from family through sale to the brutal cotton plantations of the Deep South that hung over every person as a constant menace. The big house cast its shadow across the slave quarters each afternoon, a daily reminder of the vast gulf between those who commanded and those who obeyed. From within its walls came the sounds of another world entirely: piano music drifting through open windows, laughter echoing across the gallery, the clink of crystal glasses raised in toast to prosperity that was not prosperity at all but theft so complete it stole not only labor but lives themselves. And in the evenings, particularly when the Beaumonts hosted their famous gatherings, another sound would rise from the grounds near the big house: the sound of drums, the sound of feet striking packed earth, the sound of a man being forced to dance for his own degradation, while the masters applauded and placed bets on how long he could continue before collapsing. That man was Ezekiel. No one knew exactly where Ezekiel had come from before Beaumont. The records listed him as purchased, New Orleans market, 1841, prime male, age approximately 16, notable, musical ability, good teeth, scarring on back suggests previous resistance. These cold words contained no hint of the life that had preceded them. No mention of the mother from whom he had been torn at age 10. No record of the Virginia plantation where he had spent his earliest years. No acknowledgement of the Middle Passage endured by his grandparents who had crossed the Atlantic in chains from somewhere along the Gold Coast of West Africa. What the records did capture, inadvertently, was the quality that would eventually make Ezekiel both valuable and dangerous: his gift for rhythm. This talent had been recognized early and exploited ruthlessly. In Virginia, He had been made to provide entertainment at gatherings. In the holding pens of New Orleans, dealers had paraded him before potential buyers, demonstrating his abilities like one might show off a clever trick performed by a trained animal. And at Beaumont, from his very first week, he had been designated the plantation's official musician and dancer, expected to perform on command for the amusement of the white inhabitants. But there was something the masters never understood, something that their certainty of superiority prevented them from perceiving. Ezekiel's dancing was not mere entertainment. It was not the simple shuffling and leaping they saw when they watched through their fog of wine and self-satisfaction. His movements carried meaning, ancient meaning, passed down through generations despite every attempt to sever the connections between African peoples and their cultural inheritances. Among the enslaved community at Beaumont, Ezekiel held a position of unusual significance. During the day he worked in the sugar house, one of the most grueling assignments on the plantation, where the temperatures near the boiling kettles could reach levels that regularly caused men to faint or worse. He bore this labor without complaint, understanding that any special treatment might arouse suspicion. But in the stolen moments of relative freedom, the hour or two on Sunday afternoons when work was suspended, the gatherings in the quarters after darkness fell, he became something else entirely. He became a keeper of memory. The dances Ezekiel performed in private, away from white eyes, were nothing like the performances he gave at the big house. These secret movements told stories of homes across the ocean, of gods and spirits who traveled with the stolen people to their new land of suffering, of resistance both spiritual and physical. His feet could speak of harvests in villages that existed now only in collective remembrance. His hands could trace the outlines of rituals that the slavers had tried to erase, but could never fully destroy. The community trusted him with their deepest hopes and fears. New arrivals from other plantations sought him out to share news and rumors. Those planning escapes came to him for counsel, knowing that his movements through the big house for performances gave him knowledge of the master's habits and schedules that few others possessed. He learned things while dancing. While they thought him merely a performing fool, his ears caught conversations about slave catchers' movements, about which roads were watched, about which neighbors might be sympathetic, and which would shoot a runaway on sight. And he remembered everything, every cruelty witnessed, every name of every person sold away, every child torn from parents, every back opened by the whip. He kept a ledger in his mind far more detailed than any the Beaumonts maintained in their office, and the entries in his ledger were written in a currency that the masters could not have comprehended, the currency of accounts that would one day come due. There was a woman named Ruth who washed linens in the big house and who had loved Ezekiel since they were both young. She understood what he carried inside him better than anyone. "You hold too much, Zeke," she would whisper sometimes in the darkness of their shared quarters. "A man can drown in remembering." But Ezekiel would shake his head, his eyes fixed on something she could not see. "Someone has to remember, Ruth. If we all forget, then they win. Then all this suffering means nothing. But if we remember..." He would trail off, but she knew what he meant. If they remembered, then perhaps someday, somehow, there would be a reckoning. Leave in the comments. Never give up on truth if you believe that justice must reach all the oppressed. The escalation at Beaumont followed a pattern familiar to anyone who has studied the dynamics of absolute power. When human beings are granted complete dominion over others, when no check exists on their authority and no consequence follows their cruelties, something happens to them. They become addicted to the exercise of that power. The violations that satisfied them yesterday require amplification today. The suffering they inflicted last month must be exceeded this month to provide the same thrill. Augustin Beaumont had inherited not only his father's plantation but his father's vices, refined over 3 generations of unlimited authority. What had begun as the necessary discipline of chattel slavery, the whippings, the deprivations, the casual violence, had evolved into something more deliberate and more perverse. Augustin did not simply punish resistance. He seemed to actively seek opportunities for punishment, to derive pleasure from the act of breaking human beings that went beyond any economic rationale. The year before our story begins, 1856, witnessed a cascade of horrors that even by Beaumont standards stood out as exceptional. In February, a young man named Peter was accused of stealing sugar, an accusation based on nothing more than the complaint of an overseer who had lost at cards the previous night and needed someone upon whom to vent his frustration. Peter was given 100 lashes over 3 consecutive days, his wounds rubbed with salt and turpentine, and then placed in the stocks for an additional week. He survived, but something in him did not. The man who had been known for his quick smile and his singing voice never smiled or sang again. In May, a group of 6 workers were caught holding a prayer meeting without permission after the sun had set. Religious gatherings among the enslaved were theoretically permitted under Louisiana law, but at Beaumont, any assembly not explicitly approved by the master was considered potential conspiracy. The 6 were made examples, the men branded on the forearm with the letter R for rebellion, the women subjected to public humiliation that no decent person should be asked to imagine, all of them sold within the week to different buyers, so that their punishment would include the permanent separation from everyone they had ever loved. Summer brought its own particular miseries. A fever swept through the quarters, killing 11 people, mostly the very young and the very old, while the Beaumont family retreated to their New Orleans townhouse to escape the unhealthy season. No medicine was provided to the sick. No reduction in work was granted to those caring for dying relatives. The dead were buried in shallow graves behind the quarters, their names recorded nowhere, their passing unacknowledged except by those who mourned them in secret. And through all of this, Ezekiel watched. He danced at the parties that continued uninterrupted despite the suffering occurring mere hundreds of yards away. He smiled the hollow smile expected of him, while his eyes recorded every detail. He performed ever more elaborate routines that the Beaumonts and their guests found increasingly hilarious, never guessing that each new movement was adding words to a language they could not read. One evening in late August, Ezekiel was summoned to the gallery of the big house to entertain a group of visiting planters from Natchez. Among them was a man named Crawford, known throughout the region for his particular interest in what he called the science of Negro management. Crawford had written pamphlets defending slavery as not merely an economic necessity, but a positive good, claiming that Africans were naturally suited to bondage and that to free them would be cruelty itself. As Ezekiel danced, Crawford observed with the cold, analytical gaze of a man examining livestock. At the conclusion of the performance, he turned to Augustine with an assessment that he intended as a compliment, but that contained, unknowingly, a truth more profound than he could have imagined. "Remarkable creature," Crawford said, sipping his bourbon. "There is an intelligence in those movements, Beaumont. Have you noticed? This one is dangerous. You should watch him carefully." Augustine laughed, already well into his cups. "Dangerous? Zeke? He is the most docile Negro on the place. He lives to dance. I sometimes think he would perform for free even if we did not compel him." Crawford shook his head slowly but said no more. Perhaps some instinct warned him not to speak further, or perhaps he simply did not wish to mar a pleasant evening with uncomfortable observations. Ezekiel, who had remained present to serve drinks after his performance, heard every word. His face showed nothing. His hands remained steady as he poured whiskey, but inside something shifted. The master had called him docile. The master believed him harmless. Good. Let them believe. The room where Ruth and Ezekiel lived was 10 feet by 12 feet, shared with 4 others. An elderly woman named Patience, who could no longer work the fields but earned her keep by minding children, a middle-aged man named Thomas who had lost 3 fingers to the sugar mill and now worked as a sweeper, and 2 young men barely into their 20s who spent most of their time in exhausted sleep. It was in this room, on a night in early September 1856, that the event occurred which transformed Ezekiel's cold anger into something else entirely. The event that created the conditions for everything that would follow. Ruth had been carrying their child. They had told no one, knowing that a pregnancy would mean nothing but complications, questions about the father, restrictions on Ruth's work duties, and worst of all, the eventual addition of another human being to the master's inventory. Another soul who would be born into chains and might someday be sold away as casually as one might sell a mule. But they had allowed themselves to hope, in the secret spaces of their hearts, that perhaps this child might live in a different world. The news from the north spoke of growing opposition to slavery. There were whispers of an underground road that led to freedom in Canada. Ezekiel had already begun, very cautiously, to explore whether such an escape might be possible. That night, Ruth began to bleed. The pregnancy, barely 4 months along, was ending. And because no doctor would be summoned for an enslaved woman, because no medicine existed in the quarters for such emergencies, there was nothing to do but hold her and try to keep the sounds of her agony from carrying too far into the night. She survived. The child did not, and in the morning, while Ruth lay pale and hollow-eyed on their pallet, Ezekiel walked out to work in the sugar house, with a face so carefully composed that no one who saw him could have guessed what had happened in the hours before. But something had died in him that night beyond the child he would never know. The part of him that had still believed in some future redemption, some ultimate justice that would arrive through patience and faith, that part simply ceased to exist. What remained was colder, clearer, and far more dangerous. He buried the remains of his child in secret, in a place by the river that Ruth had loved, where ancient cypress trees draped their branches toward the water, and the sound of the current almost drowned out the sounds of the plantation. He spoke no words over the grave because he had no words that could encompass what he felt. But he made a promise in his silence. A promise to Ruth, to the child, to all the unnamed dead who had preceded them. There would be a reckoning. He did not yet know its form. He did not yet know its hour. But he knew, with the certainty of someone who has crossed over from one state of being into another, that the men who had built their comfort on this foundation of suffering would one day pay the price. He returned to his dancing with renewed purpose. But now the movements were different. Now encoded in the steps and stamps and turns, there were messages being sent, preparations being made. And the men who laughed and applauded at their performing fool had no idea that he was rehearsing their destruction. The antagonists of Beaumont existed in layers, each contributing to the machinery of oppression in their own particular way. At the top, of course, sat Augustin Beaumont himself, whose combination of inherited cruelty and personal weakness made him perhaps the most dangerous variety of master, one who lacked the intelligence to question his brutality, but possessed sufficient authority to indulge it without limit. But Augustin was only the apex of a pyramid. Below him, the overseers formed a middle tier of villainy, each jealous of his own authority, each eager to demonstrate his value through the productivity extracted from his charges. Harlan Cobb, who supervised the field operations, was a man of considerable intelligence twisted toward malevolent ends. He kept detailed records of each worker's output, comparing day against day, week against week, always searching for evidence of deliberate slowing that might justify punishment. He understood the psychology of terror with an almost academic precision, knowing exactly when to strike to maintain fear without inducing the desperation that might breed revolt. William Pierce, master of the sugar house, compensated for his lack of imagination with an excess of brutality. The workers under his authority lived in constant fear, not because he was clever, but because he was unpredictable, as likely to respond to perfect compliance with violence as to actual infraction. Men learned to watch his face for the particular flush that preceded his rages, to scatter when they saw his hand move toward the short whip he kept coiled at his belt. Tobias Reeve, who managed the stables and livestock, was perhaps the most unsettling of the overseers because he seemed to genuinely believe in his own righteousness. He spoke frequently of his Christian faith, of the duty he owed to the souls under his care, and appeared unable to perceive any contradiction between these professions and his participation in a system of absolute dehumanization. He would quote scripture while ordering floggings, apparently sincere in his belief that the suffering he administered was for the victim's own spiritual benefit. Samuel Dunn was the least violent of the group, but perhaps the most efficiently cruel. His domain of storage and transport meant he controlled the distribution of food and supplies to the quarters. Short rations were his preferred punishment, doled out for infractions both real and imagined. He understood that hunger was a tool as effective as the whip and considerably less likely to damage valuable property. And then there was Cornelius Vance. If the others were instruments of a system, Vance was something more fundamental. A man who had found in slavery the perfect outlet for impulses that in any decent society would have led him to the gallows. He was not intelligent like Cobb or pious like Reeve. He was simply sadistic, with a creativity and torment that suggested either madness or something worse, a fully conscious choice to cultivate the suffering of others as a form of personal entertainment. The enslaved community knew each overseer's particular dangers and adapted accordingly. They knew which excuses might work with Cobb, which prayers might soften Reeve, which silences were safest around Pierce. But for Vance, there were no strategies except avoidance. Those who fell under his attention could only endure and hope to survive. In the autumn of 1856, a new cruelty entered the Beaumont system. Augustine, inspired by tales from a recent trip to Kentucky, instituted what he called dancing nights. Once each week, the enslaved workers would be assembled in the yard before the big house and required to dance for 2 hours while the white residents watched from the gallery. Those judged insufficiently enthusiastic would face punishment the following day. The purpose was not merely entertainment, but degradation. Augustine understood, in whatever dim way his consciousness could process such things, that forcing his victims to perform joy while experiencing only sorrow was a form of control that transcended the physical. He was not content with owning bodies. He wanted to own souls. Ezekiel, of course, was the centerpiece of these exhibitions. He was made to lead the others, to demonstrate the movements they should imitate, to perform for extended periods while the community was forced to watch. And in his heart, something crystallized. The final element of his transformation locked into place. He would use their demand against them. They wanted him to dance? Very well. He would dance them into their graves. The humiliation of November 15, 1856, marked the point of no return. On that night, the dancing was particularly cruel. A cold rain was falling, unusual for Louisiana, and the yard had become a sea of mud. But Augustine, who had consumed considerable quantities of wine at dinner, was in the mood for entertainment and would not hear of cancellation. The enslaved community assembled as ordered, their thin clothing immediately soaked, their bare feet sinking into the cold muck. The torches that usually illuminated these spectacles guttered and smoked in the rain, casting everything in a hellish, flickering light. Ezekiel was called forward to begin. He danced as he always did, but the conditions were impossible. The mud sucked at his feet, making the precise movements that characterized his performances nearly unachievable. After perhaps 15 minutes, exhaustion and the cold combined to produce the inevitable. He stumbled and fell, face first, into the mire. From the gallery came laughter, genuine, delighted laughter, as if this was the funniest thing the observers had ever witnessed. Augustine clapped his hands like a child at a puppet show. "Again! Make him do it again!" Ezekiel rose. Mud covered his face, his chest dripped from his hands. He began to dance again. And again, he fell. And again the laughter rang out. This went on for nearly an hour. The falls became more frequent as his strength failed. The laughter never diminished. At some point, Marguerite Beaumont herself came to the gallery rail to watch, her face illuminated by the torches, her expression one of bemused satisfaction at the suffering on display. When it finally ended, when the spectators had tired of their sport and retreated to the warmth of the big house, Ezekiel remained in the mud for several minutes before Ruth and the others could help him to his feet. He had not wept. He had not cursed. His face had remained a mask throughout the entire ordeal. But those who helped him back to the quarters that night would later testify that something had changed in his eyes. Some had seen determination. Others, fury. Thomas, the man with 3 fingers, claimed he had seen something else entirely. The calm, absolute clarity of a man who has made his final decision and now has only to wait for the proper moment. In the days that followed, Ezekiel's dancing did change, but not in ways his captors noticed. The movements became more complex, incorporating elements he had never shown before. New patterns emerged, particularly in the rhythms he beat with his feet, sequences of stamps and slides that seemed to follow no logic the white observers could discern. They thought, if they thought about it at all, that he was simply adding variety to his performances to avoid another muddy disaster. They did not realize that he was teaching. Every enslaved person at Beaumont who watched those performances was receiving instruction. The patterns Ezekiel danced spelled out messages in a code developed over generations, a language of resistance that had traveled from Africa to the Caribbean to the American South, evolving and adapting but never dying. The messages were simple at first. Patience. Wait. The time is coming. But as the weeks passed and autumn turned toward winter, the messages grew more specific. Prepare. Remember your assignments. When the drums speak twice, gather at the river. The masters of Beaumont watched their dancing fool perform ever more elaborate routines and congratulated themselves on their fine entertainment. They had no idea they were watching the choreography of their own destruction. The plan that emerged over the following months was remarkable for both its complexity and its elegant simplicity. Its architect was Ezekiel, but its execution would require the coordinated effort of dozens of individuals, each contributing their particular skills and access to the whole. The inner circle consisted of 8 people, carefully selected over weeks of subtle testing. There was Thomas, whose missing fingers had ended his fieldwork, but given him access to areas of the plantation, the storage buildings, the tool sheds, that more closely watched workers could not approach. There was a woman named Celia, who served in the big house kitchen and knew every corner of that structure, every hiding place, every path of egress. There was Big Samuel, named for his height of over 6 feet, who had the respect of the field hands and could communicate instructions without arousing suspicion. There were others, each chosen for a specific capability. And there was Ruth. She had not wanted to be included. The loss of the child still hung over her, and she feared that her involvement might lead Ezekiel to take unnecessary risks out of the desire to protect her. But Ezekiel had insisted. "I need your eyes in the washroom," he told her. "You see what the overseers' wives discuss. You know when the men are expected to be drunk, when the patrols will be short-handed. This cannot happen without you." The target date was set early, October 17, 1857. Nearly a full year away when the planning began, but the delay was essential. The harvest festival that Beaumont held each year on that date provided the perfect conditions. The masters would be distracted by their celebrations. Additional liquor would be brought in from New Orleans. Neighboring planters would attend with their families, creating confusion and reducing the ratio of captors to captives. Most importantly, October 17th was also the date, 11 years earlier, when Ezekiel's mother had been sold at the New Orleans market. It was the anniversary of the day his family had been destroyed forever. The symbolism was not incidental. The plan itself had multiple components. First, a group of workers would be positioned to disable the bell system that served as Beaumont's alarm. Without the bells, news of the uprising would travel slowly, buying precious time. Second, strategic fires would be set in the sugar house and several storage buildings, creating chaos and drawing attention away from the main action. Third, and most crucially, the big house itself would be secured, trapping the family and their guests inside, while their means of resistance was systematically removed. Ezekiel was clear from the beginning about what the uprising would and would not be. "We are not murderers," he told the inner circle at one of their clandestine meetings, held in the forest beyond the cane fields under the cover of a prayer gathering. "We kill only if we must, only to protect ourselves and each other. Our purpose is freedom, not revenge." Thomas, whose hands still ached on cold nights with the memory of the mill that had taken his fingers, argued for a more final approach. "They would kill us without thought. Why should we spare them?" "Because we are not them," Ezekiel replied. "Because if we become them to defeat them, then we have lost even in victory. We take their weapons, we take their horses, we take their keys, and then we disappear into the night, and we do not stop moving until we stand on free soil." The destination was Canada, reached via the network of safe houses and sympathetic souls that formed what some called the Underground Railroad. Ezekiel had made contact with a conductor, a free black minister in New Orleans who traveled under cover of legitimate religious work, and received instructions for the route north. The journey would be long and dangerous, but it was possible. Resources were gathered with painstaking care. Food was hidden in small quantities over many months, stolen from the big house kitchen by Celia in amounts too small to notice, dried and preserved by Ruth and Patience. Weapons were more difficult. 4 knives from the kitchen, a hammer from the carpentry shop, 2 axes from the woodpile. Not enough to fight an army, but enough for the initial strike. The method was given a name, in the tradition of such actions. They called it the talking feet, a reference to both Ezekiel's dancing and the long walk toward freedom that would follow. When the inner circle met, they would sometimes stamp out the basic rhythm of the plan, a sequence of beats that meant, soon, be ready. When the talking feet speak, we walk to freedom. The weeks and months that followed were a masterpiece of deception. Every morning the conspirators went to their assigned labor. Every evening they returned to their quarters with appropriate exhaustion. Every time Ezekiel was called to dance, he performed with energy and apparent enthusiasm, drawing praise from the masters for his improving skill. But beneath the surface, the community was transforming. Knowledge spread through channels invisible to the overseers. A rhythm tapped on an overturned bucket, a pattern of words woven into a work song, a gesture exchanged while passing in the yard. By the summer of 1857, nearly every enslaved person at Beaumont knew that something was coming. Most did not know the details. The risk of exposure grew with every person who possessed specific information, but all knew to be alert for the signal. 3 more full moons, 2 more full moons. 1. As October approached, the tension among the inner circle became almost unbearable. But they held. They continued their charade. They danced. And on the morning of October 17th, 1857, they rose as if it were any other day, ate their meager breakfast, and went to their assigned tasks. Tonight, the feet would speak. The final day was a study in parallel preparations. In the big house, servants decorated for the evening's festivities. Long tables were set with the Beaumont china, hand-painted with images of magnolias and shipped from England 2 generations earlier. Cases of wine were brought up from the cellar. The kitchen filled with the smells of roasting meat and baking bread, luxuries that the enslaved workers who prepared them would never taste. In the quarters, a different kind of preparation was underway. Bundles of food and clothing were assembled, hidden in corners and beneath loose floorboards. Designated runners confirmed one final time that they knew their routes. The men who would disable the bells practiced their movements in their minds. Ezekiel spent the daylight hours in the sugar house, his hands working the boiling cane, while his thoughts moved through each element of the plan, searching for weaknesses. He found none that could be remedied now. What would happen would happen. All that remained was to see it through. As sunset approached, the enslaved workforce was given an unusual allowance, 2 hours of rest before they would be expected to appear for the evening's entertainment. The dancing would begin at 8, after the white guests had finished their dinner. Attendance was mandatory. In his quarters, Ezekiel sat with Ruth. Neither spoke for a long time. There was nothing to say that had not already been said. The risks were understood. The stakes were clear. In a few hours, they would either be on the road to freedom or they would be dead. Finally, Ruth broke the silence. "I never told you something." Ezekiel looked at her. "The child. The one we lost." Her voice was steady, but barely. "I dreamed about him sometimes. It was a boy, I think. I dreamed he was running through tall grass toward a river, and on the other side of the river there was a place with no chains. And I would try to call to him, but he couldn't hear me. But he kept running anyway, because somehow he knew the way." She took his hand. "Tonight we run for him too." Outside, the sun was setting. Orange light flooded through the gaps in the walls, then faded to red, then to the deep blue of twilight. Torches were being lit around the big house. Carriages were arriving with guests. Ezekiel rose and embraced Ruth. Then he went to the door. "Be at the river before the moon reaches the top of the sky," he said. "No matter what happens, no matter what you hear, be there." He walked out into the gathering darkness, toward the big house, toward the gallery where the masters waited for their entertainment. It was time to dance. The Harvest Festival at Beaumont that year drew an unusually large crowd. Planters from neighboring parishes had come with their families, the Morgans from downriver, the Lawtons from the other side of the parish, the Thibodeau clan whose holdings stretched along Bayou La Fourche. In total, perhaps 40 white adults and a similar number of children were present, along with their personal servants who had traveled with them. Dinner had been elaborate: turtle soup, roasted duck, beef prepared in the Creole style, vegetables and breads and pastries. Wine flowed freely, as it always did at Beaumont gatherings. By the time the tables were cleared and the guests moved to the gallery to watch the evening's entertainment, a pleasant haze of intoxication had settled over the party. The enslaved workers of Beaumont assembled in the yard as commanded, perhaps 200 strong. They arranged themselves in the accustomed pattern, a space cleared in the center for the featured performers, the others standing in a semicircle, the overseers positioned at the edges to ensure appropriate enthusiasm. Torches ringed the yard, casting dancing shadows. A fire had been lit in a large iron brazier, providing both light and warmth against the October chill. From the gallery, the scene must have resembled something from a painting. The beautiful house behind them, the humble workers below, the natural order of things on perfect display. Ezekiel stepped into the cleared space. He wore his performance clothes, a loose white shirt, dark trousers, bare feet that had memorized every inch of this packed earth stage. He stood motionless for a moment, letting the anticipation build. Then the drums began. The rhythm started slow, almost ceremonial. Two men sat at the drums, the same drums that would send the signal when the moment came. Their hands moved with practiced precision, building a foundation of sound upon which Ezekiel would construct his movements. He began to dance. The opening was familiar. The shuffling steps and occasional leaps that the white audience expected. The movements that made them laugh and applaud and feel superior. But within those familiar forms, Ezekiel was doing something different. His feet were tapping out information, final preparations. Be ready. The signal comes soon. Around the semicircle of watching workers, small adjustments were being made. Big Samuel drifted toward the western edge, closer to the path that led to the bell tower. Thomas shifted his weight, his remaining fingers wrapped around the handle of a hidden knife. Celia, serving drinks on the gallery, positioned herself near the gun cabinet where the masters kept their weapons. 5 minutes passed. 10. The white audience was well entertained, calling out requests for particular movements, laughing at sequences they found especially amusing. Augustin Beaumont himself was particularly delighted, turning to his guests to point out especially clever moments. "Watch his feet," he said at one point, slurring slightly. "The rascal has rhythm, I tell you. Savage rhythm, but rhythm nonetheless." Ezekiel heard him. His expression did not change. 15 minutes. The drums were building toward something, though none of the white listeners would have recognized the pattern. The tempo increased incrementally. The watching workers felt their hearts accelerating to match. Then Ezekiel stopped. The sudden stillness was striking after so much movement. He stood in the center of the yard, arms at his sides, chest heaving with exertion. The drums continued for several beats, then they too fell silent. From the gallery, Augustin's voice irritated. "Why have you stopped? I did not say you could stop." Ezekiel did not respond. Instead, he lifted his head and looked directly at the gallery. His gaze moved slowly across the assembled white faces, meeting their eyes one by one. It was such a simple thing, such a small violation of the unwritten rules that governed these encounters, but its effect was immediate and profound. Several of the women drew back. One of the men, Crawford, the scientific advocate of slavery who had warned Augustin the previous year, set down his drink and took a step forward. "Beaumont," he said quietly, "something is wrong here." But it was too late. Ezekiel's right foot struck the ground twice, hard. A pause, then twice more. The signal. What happened next occurred with a speed and coordination that would be discussed for generations. Big Samuel and 2 others reached the bell tower before the overseer stationed there understood what was happening. He was overwhelmed, bound, gagged, alive but helpless. Thomas and his team struck simultaneously at the sugar house and the storage buildings. Flames erupted within minutes, their glow visible from the gallery, drawing shouts of alarm from the guests. In the confusion, Celia moved. The gun cabinet was locked, but she had spent months learning where the key was kept. Within seconds, she had it open. Within a minute, the weapons were being passed to waiting hands. On the gallery itself, chaos had erupted. The guests were trying to flee toward the house, toward their carriages, toward anywhere that seemed like safety. But the enslaved workers were moving too, and they were not moving randomly. Every exit was being blocked, every avenue of escape closed off. Ezekiel remained in the center of the yard, a stillness at the heart of the storm. He watched as the world he had known for 16 years came apart around him. The flames from the burning buildings painted the sky red. The shouts and screams of the white guests mingled with the focused, purposeful commands of the uprising's coordinators. Cornelius Vance, the discipline master, came running from his quarters with his whip in hand, still not comprehending what was happening. He had made it perhaps 20 feet before 3 men appeared in front of him. He raised the whip. "Get back! I'll flay every one of—" He never finished the sentence. They took him down without killing him, but by the time they were done, his whip arm would never function properly again. Similar scenes played out across the plantation. The overseers were systematically neutralized, some by force, some simply by the overwhelming realization that they were vastly outnumbered, and that resistance meant death. Most chose surrender. Within an hour, it was over. The big house was surrounded. The guests and family inside could see, through every window, the faces of those they had owned looking back at them. The weapons had been secured. The horses were being prepared for the journey north. Ezekiel walked slowly up the steps of the gallery. He stopped at the door of the big house and spoke in a voice loud enough to carry through the wood. "We are leaving. We are taking the horses, the weapons, and supplies. We are not going to harm you if you remain inside until morning. But if anyone tries to follow us, if anyone raises the alarm before dawn, we will not hesitate to defend our freedom." He paused. "You made me dance for you. For 16 years I danced while you laughed. Tonight I danced again. But this time, Mr. Beaumont, the dance was not for you. The dance was for my people. And my people have decided that they are going to walk to freedom." He turned away from the door. Ruth was waiting at the bottom of the steps, her face streaked with tears and triumph. "Is it done?" she asked. "It is beginning," he replied. They walked together toward the river, where over 200 people were gathering, their faces illuminated by the dying flames of the buildings they would never have to work in again. The exodus had begun. The column that moved north from Beaumont Plantation that night numbered 217 souls. They walked in near silence, their bare feet making little sound on the soft Louisiana earth. The few horses that had been taken were reserved for the elderly and the very young, those who could not maintain the pace required for escape. Ezekiel led them by a route he had memorized from whispered conversations with the Underground Railroad contact. They would avoid the main roads, traveling instead through the swamps and forests that most white men feared. Their destination for the first night was a farm 20 miles north, owned by a Quaker family who would hide them during the dangerous daylight hours. Behind them, Beaumont burned. The fires had spread beyond the initial targets. Whether by accident or design, the truth was never established. The flames had reached the main house itself. The white residents inside had been able to escape through a back entrance, fleeing to their neighbors to raise the alarm. But by the time the first patrols were organized, the column of escapees had already vanished into the night. What happened to the Beaumont Plantation in the weeks that followed became a matter of considerable documentation. The estate was effectively destroyed, its workforce fled, its buildings reduced to ruins. Augustin Beaumont attempted to rebuild but lacked the capital. He had been a man of apparent wealth but actual debt, his lifestyle financed by the labor he could no longer compel. Within 2 years, the property was sold to satisfy creditors. Augustine himself died in 1863, drunk and impoverished, in a New Orleans boarding house. But the impact of that night extended far beyond a single ruined plantation. News of the Beaumont uprising spread through the South with remarkable speed, carried by the very networks of communication that slaveholders had built for their own purposes. Planters wrote alarmed letters to one another. Newspapers printed breathless accounts, some accurate, many wildly exaggerated. The method employed, the use of dance as coded communication, the coordination of large numbers of enslaved people without detection, the strategic targeting of the harvest festival when masters were distracted, was analyzed and discussed. Officials in Louisiana and neighboring states issued directives prohibiting unsupervised gatherings of Negro persons for purposes of entertainment or religious expression. Dancing, specifically, was identified as a potential tool of conspiracy. In the weeks that followed, other plantations experienced disturbances clearly inspired by the Beaumont model. A similar uprising occurred in Mississippi in November 1857, this one less successful but clearly derivative in its methods. Smaller incidents, coordinated escapes, suspicious fires, overseers found bound and gagged, were reported throughout the region. The phenomenon was given a name by worried authorities: the talking feet. It referred both to Ezekiel's dancing and to the movement of escaped enslaved people northward. The phrase carried terror for slaveholders who suddenly could not look at any gathering, any dance, any innocent-seeming entertainment without wondering what messages might be passing beneath the surface. Official estimates suggested that the talking feet movement, in its various manifestations, resulted in the escape of over 500 enslaved people in the 18 months following Beaumont. The actual number was likely higher. The response of the authorities to the Beaumont uprising was swift and brutal, as such responses always were. Louisiana's governor authorized special militia units to pursue the escaped workers. Bounty hunters from across the South descended on the region, drawn by advertisements promising substantial rewards. The column that had left Beaumont together was forced to split into smaller groups to evade pursuit. Some traveled by boat up the Mississippi. Others moved overland through the forests. Still others took refuge in communities of free black people in New Orleans, hiding in plain sight until they could continue their journey. Ezekiel and Ruth were among the overland travelers, moving through terrain so dense and difficult that even experienced trackers struggled to follow. They traveled mostly by night, guided by stars and by the network of sympathetic souls who appeared at crucial moments to point the way. The journey north took 6 months. They crossed into Kentucky in February 1858, into Ohio in March, and finally reached Canada in early April. When they crossed the last border, when they stood for the first time on soil where no one could legally claim them as property, Ruth fell to her knees and wept. But their freedom came at a cost. Not everyone who left Beaumont that night reached safety. Some were captured on the road and returned to bondage, facing punishments too terrible to describe. Others died of exposure, disease, or simple exhaustion. The swamps claimed several, their bodies never recovered. And there were betrayals. Human beings under extreme pressure sometimes made choices they would later regret. One member of the column, terrified by the intensity of the pursuit, had provided information to a captured overseer in exchange for the promise of lenient treatment. That information led hunters to a group of 12 escapees hiding in a barn in Mississippi. All 12 were killed. Ezekiel heard of these losses while still on the road. Each one weighed on him. He was the architect of the uprising. He felt responsible for every life placed at risk by his planning. Ruth reminded him, again and again, that everyone who left Beaumont had done so by choice, knowing the dangers, but the knowledge was cold comfort when the names of the lost came to his ears. The community that eventually formed in Canada, in a settlement near Chatham, Ontario, numbered approximately 80 Beaumont survivors. They built homes, established farms, created a church, and began the long process of learning to live as free people. Others had scattered across the north, some to Boston, some to Philadelphia, some to smaller communities where they could disappear into anonymity. Ezekiel never stopped dancing. In the new settlement, his dances took on different meanings. They became celebrations of freedom, commemorations of those who had not survived, teachings for the children born in liberty, who needed to understand the history their parents carried in their bodies. Every year on October 17th, the community gathered, and Ezekiel would dance the steps that had started it all, the patterns that had coordinated the uprising, the rhythms that had spoken words the masters could not hear. The children would watch and learn. The elders would weep and remember. And the talking feet would speak again, telling stories that would pass from generation to generation, ensuring that what happened at Beaumont would never be forgotten. The hunt for Ezekiel himself continued for years, driven partly by the desires of ruined slaveholders and partly by the need of the system to make an example. A reward of $5,000, an extraordinary sum for the time, was offered for his capture. His description was circulated throughout the South and into the border states. But Ezekiel was not captured. The community in Canada protected its own, with a ferocity born of shared suffering. When strangers came asking questions, they were met with silence. When suspected bounty hunters appeared in the area, they found nothing but empty roads and unhelpful residents. In 1859, Ezekiel traveled to a gathering of abolitionists in Chatham, where he met a white man named John Brown, who was planning something extraordinary. Brown wanted to ignite a slave uprising by seizing the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He believed that such an act would trigger a general rebellion throughout the South. Ezekiel listened to Brown's plan and declined to participate. His reasons, as recorded by those who were present, revealed the principles that had guided Beaumont. "You want to start a war," Ezekiel reportedly said. "I understand that desire. But a war requires soldiers, and soldiers require weapons they know how to use. The people you want to free, they are not soldiers. They are men and women and children who have been systematically denied everything that makes fighting possible. What they need is not an army to follow, but a road to walk. That road exists. I have walked it. And I will spend the rest of my days showing others the way." Brown proceeded with his raid anyway. It failed catastrophically. He was captured, tried, and hanged. But some historians have wondered whether his actions, despite their immediate failure, helped accelerate the crisis that led to the Civil War. Ezekiel lived to see that war. He lived to see the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. He lived to see the 13th Amendment abolish slavery throughout the United States in 1865. And on the day the news came to Chatham that the amendment had been ratified, the old man who had once been a dancing fool for his master's entertainment gathered his community together. He was in his early 40s by then, but the years of labor and flight had aged him beyond his time. His legs, which had once moved with such fluid precision, were stiff and painful. His breathing came hard. But when the drums began, something changed. He danced. He danced the celebration he had dreamed of for 30 years. He danced for his mother, sold away when he was 10. He danced for the child Ruth had lost. He danced for every soul who had walked out of Beaumont that October night, and for everyone who had not lived to see this day. The dance lasted perhaps 15 minutes. Then Ezekiel stopped, breathless, supported by Ruth on one side and his eldest child, a daughter born free in Canada, on the other. "It is finished," he said. He died 6 months later, in the spring of 1866. His body was buried in the community cemetery, beneath a stone that bore no name, only a pair of carved feet and the words, "He taught us to walk." The story of Beaumont passed into legend, and then into something harder to categorize. In the decades following the Civil War, as the promise of Reconstruction gave way to the terror of Jim Crow, the tale was told and retold among black communities throughout the South. Details shifted with each telling. Numbers grew. Miracles multiplied. Some said that Ezekiel had possessed supernatural powers, that his dancing could summon spirits who protected the escapees on their journey north. Others claimed that he had never died at all, that he walked the road still, appearing to those who were lost or endangered to point the way to freedom. Objects associated with the story became relics. A pair of shoes, supposedly worn by Ezekiel during his performances at Beaumont, was preserved by a church in New Orleans. A drum, said to have been one of those that sounded the signal for the uprising, passed through generations of a family in Mississippi before being donated to a museum in the 1920s. Songs emerged that encoded the story. Work songs and spirituals contained references that only the initiated would understand. Lines about feet that talk, and the night the dance spoke, and walking to the river when the moon is high. These songs traveled wherever Black Americans traveled, carrying the memory with them. Academic historians approached the Beaumont uprising with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. Early studies, produced during the era when professional history was largely a white pursuit, tended to minimize the event or question its factuality. The primary sources were fragmentary: newspaper accounts, a few letters, scattered court documents. No first-person narrative from any of the participants had survived. Later scholarship, beginning in the mid-20th century, took the event more seriously. Researchers identified census records, property documents, and other evidence that confirmed the basic facts, that Beaumont Plantation existed, that it was destroyed by fire in October 1857, that a mass escape of enslaved workers occurred. The specific details, Ezekiel's role, the coded dances, the orchestrated uprising, remained harder to verify, but were increasingly accepted as probable. The debate between academic history and popular memory never fully resolved. For historians, the Beaumont Uprising was one event among many, important but not unique. For the communities that carried the story, it was something more, a testament to the capacity for resistance that slavery could never fully crush, a reminder that even under the most brutal conditions, human beings found ways to fight back. In the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, the story experienced a revival. A folk song about Ezekiel became popular in certain circles, sung at gatherings and marches. The phrase "talking feet" was adopted by some activists as a slogan, referring to the marches that were challenging segregation across the South. Today, the site of Beaumont Plantation is marked by a small historical sign, placed there in 2003 after years of advocacy by local historians and community groups. The ruins that once attracted curious visitors have largely returned to the earth, but the sign tells the basic story, that here, on a night in October 1857, over 200 people seized their freedom and walked north. Visitors sometimes leave offerings at the site, flowers, coins, small bundles of cloth. Some come to remember ancestors who were held there. Others come simply to pay respects to those whose names are lost, but whose courage endures. And occasionally, according to local reports that make no claim to scientific validity, visitors hear something at the Beaumont site after dark. Not words exactly, but a rhythm, a pattern of beats rising from the earth itself, as if the ground remembers what happened there and cannot help but repeat the message encoded in the dance of a man who refused to be broken. If you've watched until here, it's because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying "I watched until here," so I can know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if the story of Ezekiel touched your heart. Share this so that the memory of Ezekiel is never forgotten. The talking feet still speak. Listen carefully. Perhaps they are speaking to you.